Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Arts and Ideas. I'm Sue Swinand, and I'm really happy to be over at the Worcester Art Museum today and have the opportunity to give you a glimpse of a very interesting show that's here right now. It's the rediscovering of an American community of color, the photographs of William Bullard, 1897 to 1917. And I'm really lucky to have both curators with me who will be able to tell you all about the exhibition. Janette Greenwood is a distinguished scholar and professor of history at Clark University, and also an author of several books. I wanted to draw your attention to this one, which is called First Fruits of Freedom. And this deals with the migration and the struggles of the Black community coming from the South after the Civil War.
Right.
And the other curator with me today is Nancy Kathryn Burns, and she is the associate curator of prints, drawings, and photographs here at the Worcester Art Museum. And she's really distinguished herself in the last few years by pulling together a number of exceptional shows. I'll only mention a couple. One I remember was Gary Winogrand and the Women Are Beautiful, and also the Cyanotype show, which, what was that one? The
Cyanotypes, Photography's Blue Period.
Photography's Blue Period. I love that title. So thank you both so much for putting this show together for our community. You're really bringing a lot of new life into the Worcester Art Museum, Nancy. And thank you for being here today to tell us about the exhibition. I thought there's so much to talk about. Let's just start by telling a little bit about William Bullard.
All you.
William Bullard was born in the 1870s and grew up most of his growing up in Worcester. He lived in the Beaverbrook neighborhood. He didn't call himself a photographer until about 1901 in the Worcester City Directory. Before that time, he listed himself as a laborer. We don't know much at all about his professional training. He does seem to have had incredible talent. Whether he was self-taught or whether he apprenticed, we're not sure. But he did not belong to the Worcester Camera Club, which was, a popular association of people here in the city who were interested in photography. So he, in his lifetime, put together a collection of 5,400 glass negatives. And before his death in 1918.
Wow. He looks like quite a character, too. I loved the image of him sitting with his family members with their shoe soles all worn out, and his expression, he looks so impish.
He had a real sense of humor that comes through in his photographs. He not only took that image that we often refer to as an early selfie, where he sitting with his mother and his cousin, we think. They show their shoes that are kind of worn. The soles of their shoes are pretty worn out. But he also, we have another photograph of him where he put his derby hat on a sunflower and took his own image again. And later in his career, he did an interesting thing that we still can't quite figure out, but he would put his photographer's case, like the camera case, in various places in his photographs. We're not sure what that was about, but it's kind of interesting.
So he was part of the photograph.
I guess, yeah. There are all kinds of ways you can interpret it, I guess. But he did have a real playful side.
It might be that his outgoing, fun personality was also why he was able to get such nice, natural responses from his sitters.
I think there's probably a lot to that. I think he made people feel comfortable. His photographs show that they had, people felt at ease in his presence, regardless of the fact that he was white and the sitters, most of the sitters in the portraits were people of color. So he does seem to have had a way to make people feel comfortable and had a real rapport with his subjects.
How did you happen to come upon these 5,000 glass negatives.
Well, I jump in median race. So if Janette wants to start with how she got connected, I can pick up from there.
Well, you can both go
Okay.
together too.
Well, I'll begin at the beginning. I got an email from someone I didn't know, who turned out to be Frank Morrill, the current owner of the entire Bullard collection.
And the collector.
And the collector, right. And he's the fourth owner of this collection, which is really quite remarkable when you think they've been around since 1918.
Isn't it wonderful that it wasn't lost?
Yes, it is.
Or broken. That's what
I
find
mean. Like people
Right.
just throw
remarkable.
things in a dumpster, you know?
Yeah. So he said, he emailed me, I didn't know who it was, and he said, I have these old photographs of African Americans from Worcester you might be interested in. And I have to admit that I didn't actually respond to his email. It was this time of the semester, it was December, and I was like, I'll get back to him, I don't know who this is. And then fortunately he was insistent, and he emailed me again in January 2014, and I responded this time, thankfully. And I was going to Worcester the next day, and I said, well, I'll go see what he has. Frank lives in Charlton. And so he had scanned a number of the images and showed them to me on this big, beautiful Mac screen, and I was just amazed. I was just astounded. They were just so beautiful and interesting. And then he said to me, well, I also have the photographer's logbook. And we know who most of
the wonderful part of this show.
So I looked at the logbook, and you mentioned my book that I'd written about migration. I immediately recognized a number of family names of people whom I had written about in my book. So that was really exciting. And I said, Frank, I think I know who I know who some of these people are. I know some of their stories. And so it struck me that we had something really special, or I thought we did. Now, I'm not a photography expert, I'm a historian. But we began to ask around various experts, to show them what we had, and everyone was pretty much blown away by what we were showing them. And Frank and I talked about what we wanted to do with them, and I immediately, of course, wanted to sign on to this project. He's a retired history teacher, and he said, well, I'd really like to exhibit these, I'd really like to use them for some kind of educational purposes, and I'd really like to make sure that we keep it here in Worcester. So then we came and visited Nancy here at the Art Museum.
Was that maybe February?
I think it was about April, actually.
I don't want to exaggerate. So yes, then Janette and Frank came to visit me here at the museum. And I will also say that they emailed me a couple of times and I hadn't responded. But with the encouragement of a friend and colleague of mine at Clark University that I had worked on the cyanotypes project with, Christina Wilson, she said, you know what, you should take a look at these. And I'll tell you, Janette and Frank were smart, because the very first photograph they showed me was a portrait of Ralph Mendes sitting on a stoop. And it remains what I think is kind of the knockout portrait in the exhibition, at least in terms of composition and craft, as far as Bullard's ability as a photographer to be doing portraiture. And then I heard about the logbook, and I said, wow, I mean, I was really, really interested, but I wanted to do a little bit more research on my own to see, just how amazing is it really that we had the logbook and the names, and how rare is it to have this kind of album. And they proved to be true. They were right about that. And I thought, if we don't show it here, then where?
Speaking of, you did a little research. I forgot to mention your book here that you both co-authored, Rediscovering an American Community of Color. And it's terrific and filled with photographs and filled with the history of Worcester. And that's available here at the museum, I know. And maybe you could give us more information on that. We'll tag that on the end. But congratulations on that book.
I will say that as a side note that I agreed to sign on to the project as long as Ralph was actually the cover of the catalog. So,
don't you just love the
favorite
outfits they're wearing?
Yes.
It struck me, it's such a pleasure to see all the little embroidered collars and all the little handmade laces on their cuffs and the aprons, and it was just it's a very touching exhibition. It brings the history to life.
We had a speaker here, Maurice Wallace, who's the Associate Director at the Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. And he was thinking that you could actually do an entire project just on the fashion, speaking to what you had said. And we talked about porches and
hats.
Hats.
He was very interested in hats.
The fashion alone, I think, is really compelling.
I love the portrait with the big Sears Roebuck hat. That just knocked me out.
Patsy Perkins.
Patsy Perkins. Then we have the whole history of the Perkins clan here, which is great. I'd like to talk more about the immigration situation in Worcester at that time. Tell us a little bit about what was going on in the city.
Yeah, well, this is really the height of immigration in this era that Bullard took his photographs. It's really the height of immigration in the United States, late 19th, early 20th century.
Not more so than in the 20s and 30s?
Oh yeah, there were
Really?
immigration restrictions put on in the 1920s that'll cut back immigration significantly.
But they call it the Great Migration.
Oh, that's that's during, but that's a migration. I was talking about the immigration to the United States. You asked about immigration.
Okay.
So there's
Migration. I'm sorry.
That's okay. There's a big spike in European immigration to the U.S. at this time. So if you look at the Beaverbrook neighborhood where Bullard lived and where many of these people lived here in the exhibition, it was really a mix of all kinds of ethnic groups. Almost any ethnic group you can find in Worcester at the turn of the century was living in that neighborhood. And so added to that European immigration then is a migration of African Americans who are coming from the South at this time. And this actually predates the Great Migration that really begins in the era of World War I. So this migration that is reflected in
blacks to the north, basically. Yeah.
This migration is really rooted begins in the time of the Civil War, the folks who come to Worcester, and the first migrants come from the South as emancipated slaves who come to the city through connections that they make through Worcester teachers and ministers and local individual soldiers who went south during the Civil War.
Many of the photographs are of emancipated slaves.
Yes, many of them are, and of their children and grandchildren. So that migration's beginning in the 1860s, and it's continuing through this period, through 1900.
They were living compatibly with Swedes and other.
It seems that way. I mean, it's the Beaverbrook neighborhood, again, where most of these photos were taken, had roughly a 12% population of people of color, African Americans and Native Americans, many African Americans who came from the South. But the city itself had a very small population of people of color at that time, only about 1% of the population.
Wow.
So this is a little residential pocket.
So it was a concentration
in that neighborhood among three.
I love the map, that historic map that shows the Beaverbrook neighborhood between Chatham Street, Park Avenue and May Street and
Chandler, yeah.
Chandler, yeah. So you Worcester natives, you can see right if it's on your street. But so they were all living there, and
many of them were. There were basically three neighborhoods that had concentrations of people of color. Again, it's a small population, so there's never a black neighborhood per se. I mean, people are living among all different kinds of ethnic groups.
That's nice that was not segregated at that point.
Yeah.
So how did Bullards Methods differ from portrait studios of the time?
Well, I mean, one thing that I can say that is unique is that, at least in terms of part of the reason we know that he kind of aspired or could be considered semi-professional is because he stuck with glass negatives. And around the turn of the century is when you have the birth of the Brownie camera from Kodak, and everyday people can buy a camera, but it's celluloid film. And I suspect that Bullard, like many studios, retained working with glass negatives because the midtones were clearer, you had better crisp definition still using the glass negatives, But from there, I think that the similarities pretty much end. Bullard did not have a studio. We have no evidence that he ever worked at a studio. So he was, a one-man operation, schlepping a very relatively large camera around.
On his bicycle.
Well, we think that it's likely that he probably had some kind of attachment, maybe, that he would have used to carry them or to bring them along with him. But we don't know for sure.
Yeah, I love the fact that bicycles were a big deal in those days.
Very big deal.
There are several photographs with bicycles, and having a bike must have been like like a car, really. You could go places and do things. And
absolutely, and Worcester was a major hub for cycling. I don't think a lot of people realize how important cycling was to the economy here, even. There were 6 manufacturers of bicycles in the greater Worcester region. There were 12 bicycle shops in the area.
And clubs, bicycle clubs.
And clubs. Yeah. And I think, perhaps to this exhibition, the most important club is the Albion Cycling Club, which was an all-black bike club that exists at the turn of the century in Worcester. And because this was such an active hub for cycling, it attracted major figures in cycling, including Major Taylor.
You said Major.
Marshall Taylor.
I love this book. It's about a historic figure in Worcester who was a young boy, but he became world famous.
Exactly.
As a champion.
In 1899, he wins the world championship in cycling in Montreal. And as you can imagine, he was an important figure for Worcester as a whole, but particularly, I would assume,
a role model
for the African American community. And we have several photographs in this exhibition that feature individuals with bikes. A personal favorite of mine is Rose Perkins with her bicycle. One of the reasons I like this photograph so much is that during the turn of the century, we have the kind of most nascent moment of what we might call the new Negro movement. And at the turn of the century, cultural intellectuals, I would say, like W.E.B. Du Bois, are encouraging African Americans to showcase themselves as prosperous, cultured, and as intellectuals.
And we have quite a few photographs that do just that.
Most absolutely. I think an iconic one would be the photograph we have of the composer and musician David T. Oswell holding his viola. But what I think is particularly interesting about the cycling images is that they're really evocative of leisure. They're evocative of a culture that was built here in Worcester of African Americans, people of color as a whole, participating in what was kind of the most chic and hip activity that was going on at the time. And Rose is not just the new Negro in her participation within cultural pastimes, she's also the new woman. And this is something that Janette had brought up to me, and I found that more and more compelling, and I've really thought about that a lot because, as Janette has pointed out to me, that cycling, while popular, was really associated more with women who were white and more kind of the college-educated woman.
Tennis and cycling.
Exactly.
Golf.
And Rose Perkins, in choosing to have her portrait taken with a bike. I think
culottes.
And yep, the divided skirt. It was a skirt in the front, pants in the back. I think that's very interesting. I think that the idea of African Americans, people of color, serving as agents in how they choose to be represented in their portraits is important.
Yes.
We do have traditional portraits. For example, Rose with her brothers Abraham and Edward. where you're posed in a more traditional way. But I really find it compelling when you find photographs that are non-traditional. Reuben Griffin leaning against a tree, the people choosing to have themselves posed with their bicycles.
This is a very poignant photograph of the brothers, though. I mean, these people had lived through slavery, and the portrait is so evocative of their suffering and their pain, and there's also a certain element of fear in their faces, mistrust. So the fact that Bullard takes photographs of people slightly later, or the fact that he makes contact and is able to show what you're saying, a leisurely side where they're feeling comfortable and want to show a different image of themselves.
Yeah, I think that one of the best compliments that I've received since this exhibition started, we received an email from someone who said, I've always considered myself a progressive, enlightened person, but it wasn't until I went to your exhibition that I realized that I was retaining stereotypes of what African Americans would look like at the turn of the century. You may not expect to see Patsy Perkins with her, beautiful hat and lingerie dress, which was very chic at the turn of the century. You might not expect to see, someone in a three-piece suit like David T. Oswell.
Yes, yeah, wonderful. There are also Native Americans in this exhibition, which tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. When Frank first approached me and I first looked at these images, we kept referring to them as African Americans in Worcester. And one of the first things we did was to meet with some older members of the community here in Worcester, to have them begin to go through the photos with us. We had names that we could attach to most of them. And they pointed out right away, like the Native American connections in these photos, which made us exactly.
Yeah.
They knew, they saw, they read the photos that way as well. So that was very helpful to us, and it really opened up a whole new chapter in thinking about these images and this community of African Americans and Native Americans that goes way back to the 18th century.
And isn't it wonderful that you found these while these people are still alive and can come in and see their ancestors?
That's been a really exciting part
thrilling.
Of the exhibition.
Yeah.
And I want to say too, it's not only that they've come in to see them, which is wonderful, but they really helped us with the research.
And you had a lot of cooperation between, who were the contributors?
Yeah, we put together a community advisory board of people in the community who were recommended to us, who talked a lot about what they wanted to see come out of the exhibition and helped us contact family members. And then Clark students, of course, have also been deeply involved in this with the research. Nancy and I co-taught a seminar at Clark this past spring where students focused in on 2 photographs, had to write labels, wrote an essay for our website.
It's a community project.
Right, and they also interviewed a descendant. So one of the things you'll see in this exhibition, which I think is really important, is we have the voices of family members, of descendants.
Wonderful.
Among most of these photos, where they're commenting on what the photographs mean to them.
We're almost out of time, so if there's any last tidbit you want to get in, now's the moment. But other than that, I will say that if you want to know more about the things that people said about their ancestors, or there's a wonderful website that you have put up both at the Worcester Art Museum site, and what is the address for the?
Yeah, it's www.bullard.org.
Bullardphotos.org.
Sorry, bullardphotos.org.
Bullardphotos.org. But you can read the comments, the history, you can see the maps, you can see every image is up there. So it's like taking a course just to read that website. It's wonderful.
Okay. I guess I would add that the exhibition is on view until February 25th, and that the Worcester Art Museum is open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 to 4 p.m.
And I would add, you better get over here, because it's really a lifetime experience to see this. I've never seen a show like this before with the documentation that you've gotten with it. So come on over and take a look at the show. I know you'll love it. And I hope to see you next time for another edition of Arts and Ideas. Thanks for joining us.